Well, welcome along, everybody. I don't know if anybody else is coming in, or I'll just carry on. I'll carry on. Welcome along to our forum session this afternoon. As you can see, it's industry costings and fairness in the supply chain. I'm James Baxter, the Chairman of the British Free Range Egg Producers Association. And it's 2 years now since we had our last pig and poultry event. And what dramatic changes we've seen in the industry in the last 2 years. This time 2 years ago, we were in the thick of the BFREPA Breaking Point campaign, which was highlighting the high costs of production and the unfair slice of the cake that producers were receiving for their eggs. At that particular pig and poultry, we warned that supplies would drop if prices at farm gate did not increase, and that's exactly what actually happened. Eventually, as the shelves emptied, the penny dropped that we were serious. Retailers had made the mistake of thinking that egg production was the same as dairy and beef and sheep, where there was no opportunity to actually pause production. So we ended up with empty hen houses because they were not profitable at the current return. So DEFRA then held a crisis meeting in London in early December 2022. Mark Spencer, the Minister, was there along with industry representatives, retailers and packers. The retailer representatives had their feet firmly held to the fire and tried to blame avian influenza and everything but the real reason, which was that the poor egg price and obviously the 2025 cage-free pledge was not helping either. So it's funny how the retailers never actually asked the egg industry if cage-free by 2025 would be possible. And even to this day, I think there's still a lack of commitment from retail on what exactly is going to happen when this comes along. So at that meeting, I hammered home the point that the balance of risk and reward was all wrong. Producers were taking most of the risk, and it seemed to us that retailers were taking most of the money, and that needed to stop. And at that time, BFREPA, in conjunction with ADAS, were working hard on developing a costings model, which was going to demonstrate the accurate and honest costs of free-range and organic egg production. We would then be able to use this robust data in discussions with packers and retailers to show how we could produce eggs in a sustainable and fairer way for all of the supply chain, and we could secure the future of British egg supplies in the future. So anyway, enough from me. I'll now hand you over to, we'll hear from Jason Gittins from ADAS about the costings, and after that then we're going to come back and hear from John Powell from DEFRA about the fairness in the supply chain study. Thank you. Jason.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon, everybody. ADAS has been preparing cost of production figures for BFREPA in the Ranger magazine now for a good number of years. And it really started as just a sort of general guide for new producers in terms of likely setup costs and expected production costs. But the approach has evolved, as James has said, and we know that the costings that we calculate now are used by some as the basis for prices back to producers. So we do appreciate the importance of the work. Figures each month are set out in, Figures each month are set out in this sort of format in the Ranger magazine, and they're presented, if you can just see it there, as being presented independently by ADAS. As well as the free range figures that you can see on the left-hand side there, we prepare a separate costing as well for organic production. So we review, we update production costs every month, and in general, we gather information from people who can give us a good perspective across a good number of farms. And we put most emphasis each month on the costs that are large and volatile. So clearly top of the list in that respect is feed cost. but we do review all costs periodically. Last year, BFREPA arranged a series of roadshow meetings that some of you may have attended. And after these, a major review of the approach and the reporting method was carried out. So in the available time today, I'm just going to talk you through the current approach that we use. First of all, though, I think I just must say a word about the difficulty of quoting a single cost of production figure in terms of pence per dozen. Because if we did a survey of producers, there would be a wide range of different costs. So what we're looking for is to get that figure right in the middle of the graph there, where most people are, and we accept that some people, for whatever reason, will have a higher cost of production than the average, and also that some will be below average cost of production. So our principle throughout all the work is really to look at what's typical for the sector as things stand. And to help us do this, in conjunction with BFREPA, we've established a costings committee. So that's a group of around about 10 people with a range of different interests and expertise. And we in ADAS can use them as a sort of sounding board to provide guidance and suggestions and information for us to consider. So the starting point is to define what we mean by a typical free-range and organic unit. And we characterize these as units with 32,000 birds free range, 6,000 organic. So the aim is to calculate the cost of production for existing houses, and that's important, it's existing houses rather than proposed new build. One of the key objectives we have at the moment is to be clear, so that you can look at any of the costs, any of the individual items, whether it's a large one or a small one, and understand how it's been calculated. And I think there are two benefits to this. The first is about transparency, so that the assumptions are clear. But the second is that it provides a clear basis for individuals or even for groups to adjust the figures if they don't quite fit for them, and then arrive at a cost of production which is specific. So with all the assumptions that we make, we set out the principles and the assumptions in two annotations documents that you may have seen. So all these are available on the BFREPA website. One for free range, the other is for organic. And in these we set out each of the assumptions that we make, and also the assumptions we make around flock performance. And the two documents are updated every month. So if you go onto the BFREPA website into the members area, then the latest version is always there for you to have a look at. Separately, we also calculate an average egg price paid by packers each month. So for this, we gather information from a range of different sources, so that the figures that we get are as representative across the sector as possible. We weight the responses on the basis of the size of the throughput of the egg packer. So the price information for a large throughput packer would weigh heavily, if you like, on the total than a small packer. And the current average that we've got, if you look at this month's Ranger magazine, £1.51 for free range, £2.25 for organic. So those are the producer prices. That's not cost of production, that's producer price. And then periodically, of course, BFREPA carries out an egg price survey of producer members, and that allows a comparison between our figures and the BFREPA figures. Back to cost of production. So we start off by making assumptions on flock performance in terms of egg numbers and feed intake. So in terms of egg numbers, for free range, we base our assumptions on the average of 3 different published breed standard figures up to 78 weeks of age. Now you might question whether this is actually what the average existing producer is getting or not, whether they're actually getting breed standard. But the figure is not really intended to be there as an industry average. There's 2 reasons really why we take this approach. The first is transparency again, back to that, because we have published figures, it's clear where the information has come from. But secondly, it provides a really strong basis for then setting out the inputs needed to achieve target performance and the cost of those inputs. So for instance, we assume that the houses have to be reasonably modern to achieve breed standard, high levels of input of labour are needed, comprehensive vaccination policy for pullets, and clear vet and med inputs throughout the lay-in period as well, including things like wormers and red mite control, which we include as standard. So what we're trying to do is to balance, if you like, high output on one side with all the high level inputs needed on the other, so we balance the two in a fair sort of way. For organic production, there are no specific published breed targets, and for that reason, we do have to use a figure that's based on expert industry judgment. And we talked to numerous people to decide what that is, and there would be a difference between free range and organic. But we still assume the same depopulation age at 78 weeks. For feed, for free range, again, we use standard breed target figures, and we use one derived from industry expert judgment for organic, because there isn't a reference we can use for that. If we turn to the costs side, then all the items that we include are included on this slide. There isn't time to go through all of them today, of course, so I'm just really going to concentrate on the ones on the top line. But if you can see the slide okay, then you can just peruse the various inputs that we look at there to see that we do include as much as we can for everything. So if I move on to the most significant of the cost items, which is feed. So to calculate the feed price, we use a standard feed specification, one for free range, one for organic. Those specifications are not prepared by ADAS. We use a commercial poultry feed specialist to provide a specification that they feel is appropriate to achieving breed standard performance. So we take that specification and we then ask a range of different feed compounders each month to provide a price quotation for that feed for a typical free range unit, an organic unit, and that figure inclusive of the materials, the manufacture, the transport, and the margin figure. And then from those prices, we calculate our monthly average, and we then get the feed cost on a per dozen basis. And the prices that we have, if you look at the current Ranger magazine, which would be ones that we sourced in around mid-April, £311 a tonne for free range and £5.21 for organic. If we move on to pullet costs, then again, we gather information from a range of different sources, and we include the average cost of additional vaccines needed to achieve breed standard performance. And we use this information to calculate our average pullet price, which for April was $5.38 for free range and $6.88 for organic. And we also include the cost of pullet finance within our figures as well. If we turn to labour cost, then this is one that we know there is a lot of variation. We have a lot of discussions on this. It does vary for a number of reasons, including whereabouts you are in the country. So for our figures, we look first of all at how much labour time is needed in total, and then we look at the likely unit cost of that labour on an hourly basis. So in the annotations document, we have listed all the jobs that need to be done on the farm, from daily tasks such as egg collection and flock inspection, to things that you might do on a weekly basis, quarterly, perhaps once per flock, things like record keeping and working with auditors and that sort of thing. We have itemized each of those, and we've tried to cost how much time it's going to take in each of those. So we arrive at a total number of figures for each of the two, free range and organic. And when we then turn on to the cost of that labour. So when we were reviewing this last year, the labour figure we adopted was £12.50 an hour for the labour. So that was based on a number of different discussions we had, and it was also broadly in line with the findings from a BFREPA survey that was done around about last summer. Since then, of course, the minimum of the living wage price has increased, and so in April of this year, we adjusted our labour figure upwards by the same percentage increase as the living wage had increased, and we now get a figure, we use a figure of £13.75 as our labour figure. We also assume that employers pay pension contribution and national insurance for all of their employees, although that may not always be required. And we also account for the fact that it's, of course, it's a 7-day-a-week job. We allow for holidays and things as well. So at the end of it, we get a total labour requirement for the flock that we can then use to calculate labour input and labour cost per dozen eggs. And then moving on to capital costs. So as I said a few minutes ago, our costings assume existing houses rather than new houses. But in practice, there's a wide range there in going from very modern houses, recently built at relatively high cost, and conversely there's some much older houses that would have cost less to build and to equip at the time. So the starting point of our approach is to assume that you need a relatively modern house in order to achieve breed standard performance. The figure we currently use for that is £42 per bird. Now I do appreciate that costs have increased in last years, and so the cost today, if you're putting up new, would be a figure much higher than that. We then split the cost into two parts. So we look at the cost of the building itself, which we depreciate over 20 years, and the equipment inside it, which we depreciate over 10 years. And we use the current Bank of England interest rate, which we check every month, plus 3% to calculate our costs of repayments based on these figures. So we do appreciate that capital costs will vary, interest rates will vary, and in the annotations document we have a number of sensitivity and other calculations. So if your capital cost is different to our assumption, it's a few pounds higher or lower. If the interest rate you're actually paying is a little bit higher or a little bit lower, you can see the adjustment and the effect that will have on the costings in the annotation document. So when we pull it all together, these are the current costs of production which are in this month's Ranger magazine. So on the left-hand side, our calculated cost of production for free range is £1.27 per dozen, and for organic it's £2.07 per dozen. And you can see with the various parts of the pie there that, as you know, feed is the biggest, but pullet, labour and capital are also significant costs, and all the others come to something less than 15% of the total. So the big numbers are in those four items that I've talked you through. Should just emphasise that these costs of production figures include no margin, so there's no financial margin assumed for the producer within those figures. So we present them as simply a cost of production exercise. Just like to finish by thanking all the various industry people who provide a lot of really valuable information to us in doing this work. We always appreciate that we're giving you another job to do, but I do hope, and you would agree, that it is useful information and helpful to the industry, as James suggested at the start. Should say that if anyone would like to contribute information in future, we'd always be very happy to hear from you. So, thank you for your attendance and attention this afternoon, and I'll head back to James at that stage.
Thank you very much, Jason. I can certainly vouch for the fact that we've really left no stone unturned when it came to doing these costings. I know because I was involved in some of the meetings, and when you've got 12 people in the room, there was at least 12 different opinions when it came to everything. And we really drilled down into the data in a big way. You would hear mentions of breed standards, you would hear mention of experts in the industry. These are really comprehensive and really accurate costings. I would say that you could not challenge anything to be very far off the mark. They've been a tremendous asset to us as farmers going forward now, where we can clearly see, look, where's our margin? Can we actually make some money here? So anyway, look, if anybody wants to ask a question or two from Jason, I have time for a question or two now. I'll just get a microphone for you. Over here, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Harriet Heap, based at Chippendale Foods. And my question is, with the rise in white free-range birds, is there any discussion about potentially bringing in a white-based cost of production?
I would say over to you on that one, Jason.
So it's switched on. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so I should have clarified, and I think it was hopefully apparent that the figures that we do at the moment are for brown birds, so it's not directly relevant. I guess if we were doing a white one, there would need to be some differences, and I guess cycle length is one that would need to be looked at, but feed intakes and that sort of thing. I guess it's, if there's a requirement, if there's a demand for it, James, then it could be done. A lot of the principles would be the same, but I think we just have to identify the things that are different for white birds and adjust those. So it wouldn't be starting from scratch, it would be building on what we've already got and tailoring it to a slightly different need, probably.
Thank you very much. I would say that from my point of view, in the white birds which we've seen when we've been going around the country, most of the costs are obviously the same. The labour costs, the building costs, etc. I suppose the big one would be how many eggs. And I think the jury's still out exactly on where it sits, because egg size is different, and if you're on a graded contract, you're getting less for a graded egg perhaps. But you've also got I suppose, seconds and stuff all have to be taken into consideration. There's so many things that would probably need to be updated. Any other questions? David? Yes.
There's always one James, it's me. Dave Grass, Lake Six. We did talk in the past actually with Jason about feed additives, and I'm still not sure where that is. I have some producers, and you talk to major management of feed companies, and 60% of the feed going out of their mill has additives in it. 300 additives, some up to 120 quid a tonne. I know most of my producers have additives in their feed. 50, 55 quid a tonne, be that oyster shell, fluid and vet, whatever. And that isn't captured anywhere. Why not?
Thanks, David. It's a good point, and one that we've discussed with a number of people, and we've pretty agonised over it to some extent, really. We know that there's a lot of additive use, and just to confirm what you say, we don't include that in the figures at the moment. I think the question that we ask ourselves is, if you have relatively new buildings, if you have very clear biosecurity, you spend a lot on clean out, you have a lot of veterinary input, you have the sort of high spec feed that I've talked about, if you have the pullets and comprehensive vaccine, the question we're asking is, well, do you need, for a routine and typical situation, do you need additives on top of that? That's the sort of question I think we're getting to. And I think at the moment we're saying the answer is probably not, but I think others would, there's people who would see it the other way. So I think it's something that we keep reviewing, and I think if you look at the annotations, we keep saying it's under review. So we do keep looking at it, and I think that's the sort of question that we keep going through, and we sort of keep asking ourselves, really. So that's where we are. That's what question we're trying to ask anyway. But if others have got views, I guess we'd be interested, not now, but at some stage.
Thank you. It's a good question though, David, because we went to a lot of trouble to try and calculate the average, what we'll call additional vaccine cost, which we put into pullets, and that has been incorporated into the costings. I suppose maybe the question is, if somebody's putting an additive in, I'm assuming the additive has been sold on the fact that it's creating a benefit for the hen. So therefore, is it a direct cost? You know, is it actually £10 in for £20 out? Then it's not a cost, is it? It's a benefit. But there may be other. I'm intrigued to know what the £120 a tonne additive is. That sounds really quite expensive. That must be a really high spec additive. So, any more questions? Okay then. I suppose I'll ask one that was interesting for me. I may have missed this, but is there a line in the costings for environmental costs? You know, people, larger producers who have IPPC costs, and there'll be probably several other things that would be creeping in to every producer. I just wonder if they're included there.
We're sort of aware of that one. We take our typical unit at the moment as being 32,000 birds for free range. So that puts it under the threshold for environmental permitting for IPPC. Clearly, if you're above 45,000, if you're 48 or something, then you'll have that as additional cost. So we don't include that direct cost at the moment because we're assuming that the average producer is under the threshold. But clearly, I know that there are some units that are not.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much, Jason. I think we'll move on to our second presentation today. John Powell from DEFRA, who's going to come up and tell us what he knows about the fairness in the supply chain contract. Thank you, sir.
James, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon about the Supply Chain Fairness Review. Before I do, can I just plug a few other things on behalf of DEFRA? First of all, if you weren't aware, yesterday we announced that DEFRA will be proceeding with legislation to implement the removal of the 16-week derogation for eggs in the event of mandatory housing orders, for example, during an avian influenza outbreak. So the intention is to proceed fairly quickly with that so we can get it laid before Parliament before the summer. Secondly, if you haven't already, please do visit the DEFRA stand. We're actually right down the other end, but please, as poultry producers, egg producers, if even some of the pigs people are here today, please look at the DEFRA offer, because there's plenty for you to see and to understand and hopefully to take up from our animal health and welfare pathway, which I'm sure many of you will be here later for Stuart Houston's discussion panel. But really do look at this. It's support for endemic diseases plus support for vet visits and capital investments too as part of that offer. The SFI, if you have land, please do go and talk to the DEFRA people as to what might be possible for you to access. And also our grant schemes, a number of them, but offering grants for technology, innovation and productivity, amongst other things. Plenty for you to look at and explore and as I say, hopefully to take up. So please do visit the DEFRA stand today or do visit our website or gov.uk and explore some of those opportunities. Obviously today I'm here to talk about the Supply Chain Fairness Review that we undertook in the egg sector. Yesterday, alongside the Prime Minister's Farm to Fork Summit, we published the response to that consultation. And I'd like to share with you the findings of the review. So first of all, just as background, James alluded earlier to the situation that you're all more than aware of a couple of years ago when we did see somewhat of a crisis in the egg sector with producers, as James has explained, not being able to share the increased costs that had occurred as a result of the war in Ukraine. And as they weren't able to pass on the costs along the supply chain, took the decision to lower the number of laying hens they had and therefore reduce the number of eggs that were available. Immediately, of course, we did respond with a ministerial roundtable that brought the supply chain together. I'm pleased to say that shortly after that we did start to see some impact, but it was clear to the government that from that particular situation that a supply chain fairness review was appropriate for the egg sector. So we launched a consultation on the 31st of October last year, and it closed on 22nd of December last year. First of all, thank you to everyone that responded and submitted evidence to the consultation or completed surveys through their trade associations. We had 40 direct responses, but submissions from the NFU, BEIC, BFREPA, all put forward the views of their members, in some cases surveying them in advance, which provided insight from over 200 egg producers, in addition to those who directly responded. Of those direct respondents, 23 were producers, 11 were packers, 2 were wholesalers, 4 were retailers, 7 were trade associations, and 2 were other. I'm quite intrigued what the others were, but and of those direct respondents, there was a good geographical spread as well. We had 25 that were based in England, 12 in Scotland, 10 in Wales, and 6 in Northern Ireland, and again 2 in other. So I'm not again quite sure where they happen to be situated. But of course it was a UK-wide consultation, and it's good that we did get that good geographical spread and a wide cross-section of those from across the supply chain. So let me move on as to what you're really interested in, which is the findings. It was clear that many of those who responded confirmed that there were, in many cases, good relationships within the supply chain. And many examples of mutually beneficial agreements were given. However, we did find a number of aspects of concern that led us to commit, as we have now done, to introduce a regulatory framework for contracts. Most respondents did confirm that they have written contracts, but there was also a relatively high rate of verbal agreements within the industry. And we know from both this and previous supply chain reviews that it's those cases, the verbal agreements, where issues can occur if disagreements arise. The review also found that changes in contracts often occur quite frequently, with instances of unilateral changes in a particular concern for those affected. As with other reviews, pricing has again been a primary concern for producers. Let me confirm, we are not going to regulate for what prices should be. That should and must be left to market dynamics and commercial negotiation. What we are seeking to do, though, is address areas of potential unfairness within contracts to ensure that contracts work for both negotiating parties. We heard from many producers, again going back to the crisis in 22, that when that particular crisis occurred and the shortage of eggs was seen on retail shelves, that this was due specifically to the rapid rise in input costs above the cost of production and a resulting lack of confidence from producers. This led to businesses investing in fewer flocks, and while our consultation showed that many producers now have access to contracts, that some of which do track feed prices and other costs, we know that dynamics can shift. Roughly a quarter of respondents felt that contracts they'd entered into in the last 5 years didn't meet their needs. And responses from those that were surveyed by both the NFU and BFREPA showed similar concerns. The vast majority of respondents agreed that all contracts should be written contracts. Many agreed that a set structure would be beneficial, but most didn't believe that flexibility would be needed. There were calls for contracts to include clear termination and notice periods, transparent pricing mechanisms, defined grading standards, payment terms, and dispute resolution processes. Respondents also agreed that unilateral changes should be prohibited. So that's the findings. Let me now explain what we're going to do in terms of next steps. The first thing is to confirm that we've both learnt a lot from the review, and it's also reinforced many of the understandings that we had. So while we are planning to proceed with the introduction of a regulatory framework, we know that one size does not fit all. We therefore intend to tailor our powers to address the issues faced in the egg sector. You'll be aware that we've already commenced and published regulations in the dairy sector and are at the moment negotiating with the pig sector on a similar regulatory regime. But we acknowledge that every sector operates differently and has different needs. So therefore, we intend to work closely with the egg industry to ensure that whatever regulatory system is put in place for the egg sector is the solution that best meets the needs of the egg sector and all of the players in the egg sector. This will mean that in some areas compromises may need to be found between the businesses that operate in different parts of the supply chain. One area, though, where we will be following the same approach that we've used in the dairy and the pig sector is that we will soon be sharing draft proposals for that regulatory framework with the industry. And we want to actively and proactively engage with key stakeholders from all sides of the supply chain. I can't give you a specific date as to when that will start, but we do aim to start to commence discussions with you in the summer. I can confirm, finally, just in closing, that we are very much committed to working with the sector, and the regulations that are set to be introduced will ensure fairness and transparency across the supply chain to help the sector to thrive going forward in the future. And I might just add my thanks to BFREPA and ADAS for the presentation before on costs. One of the challenges that we had in the crisis in 22 was the lack of data and the lack of transparent data. So I really do support the work that you're doing and encourage people to get behind that and to use it so that we, as well as government, have that evidence to support action when it's needed to support you as an industry. As I say, going forward, we look forward to working closely with you on the egg supply chain, putting in place the regulatory framework, as I say, that will work for all sides of the industry. So thank you for your time, and again, happy to take any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. It's quite apt that it's called, fairness in the supply chain, because that was where the basis for the costings has always come from, is that we wanted fairness in the supply chain. And there was a huge thought within the industry, producers, I'll say producers really, that it was unfair. And now we've got really robust data, which we've all spent a lot of money on and a lot of time on. And it's good that it's going to be useful for all of us. Also welcome the fact that the 16-week rule is going to now get updated. That'll be a huge benefit, not just to the producer, but especially to our packers and retailers going forward. Just simplify the whole thing. None of us want AI, none of us want housing orders, but when they happen for a very good reason. And also quite pleased to hear that, you said that many good relationships exist throughout the supply chain, which is great. A wee bit concerned when you said that 25% felt it was unfair, but that's what we're working on, and that's what we're going to fix. So, do we have any questions for John from anybody on the floor here? Over here.
Hello, Richard Griffiths, British Poultry Council. Just wondering, obviously this review was not the first one that DEFRA have done. Have there been any major similarities or indeed differences between the different sectors and in the different reviews?
Thanks, Richard. Yes, you're right, this is not the first. The dairy supply chain review was actually commenced in 2020 as a result of challenges that arose during the COVID outbreak. We've then since done the pig supply chain review, which was as a result of the crisis with the pig sector we had a few years ago, and recently, obviously, the egg consultation, which came out of the crisis with the egg sector, and lastly, we've undertaken a review on the horticulture sector. So there is a theme, which is they've often come out of a crisis to start with. So therefore, it's been a result, the need to do a supply chain review has been the result very clearly of problems that have been seen and experienced in the supply chains. There have been differences though between the type of problems that have been experienced. In some cases it was a matter of the pricing structure, others it was relationships between the producer and the processors, in other cases it was the lack of sharing the costs through the supply chain. So subtleties between each sector, which is why, as I said, we're not just trying to one-size-fits-all solution. We need to make sure that we're really clear as to what the challenges are that each sector is facing, and that the solution we put in place meets the needs of the sector concerned and actually addresses the problem, which is underlying an unfairness at some point in the supply chain. And I should probably have also mentioned that, of course, we are also going to be doing a review, or we're looking certainly at a supply chain review of the broiler sector, and many of you took part in the round table that Mark Spencer hosted a couple of months ago, which I'm probably going to say hasn't come out of a crisis, but has probably come out of what might be a crisis. So we are obviously are working with you and looking as to whether we do need to do a full review, and if so, what that might look like and what specifically the consultation might cover. Thanks, Richard.
Okay. Thanks, John. Interesting you said earlier it's going to start in the summer, in inverted commas, so we'll see when that happens.
It's a British summer, of course.
Yes, it could be October. Gary has a question here. We've got a microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And firstly, just to endorse James's thanks from the industry, John, to yourself and your team on the 16-week derogation and putting through legislation, or in the process of putting through legislation to remove that. So a big thank you for achieving that. Will the process that you describe survive a general election? And can you give us an indication, and I'll ask no more than that, when we may see the contract, I'll put it like this quite bluntly in a way, but when will that be come into force? And will, based on the dairy sector, which we're keen to learn more about how that process is going in that sector, we've got a watching brief, but we're not involved in it, or many of us aren't, so it'd be interesting to know how that's going. Will this be peas in a pod, this contract, or will it just contain mandatory elements that all contracts must contain? Can you bring that contract to life? I know this is engagement which you talked about will commence in the summer, but could you bring, possibly based on the dairy contract, could you bring it to life what that might look like at the end of this engagement process? Thank you.
Gary, thank you first of all. A very good question, and I'm going to do my best to probably not answer it as you might like, I'm afraid, because as I made clear in the short speech I made earlier, we're not yet in a position to circulate that. But what I can tell you is that it's going to cover the areas of concern that we've identified. So standards, pricing, mechanisms, payment terms, and a resolution dispute process. It's not just going to duplicate the dairy sector regulations, which you can read. They're published. The SI was published some weeks ago in Parliament and has already gone through various stages of the parliamentary process. So you can read that, but we're quite clear we're not just going to duplicate existing provisions. We're going to make sure that the provisions for the egg sector relate specifically to the challenges and problems of the egg sector. And we want the industry to play the major role in setting what are the areas, as basically I said, of consensus and compromise, where there are areas that it is felt appropriate for them to be included in contracts to better further the interests of all of the supply chain. So that will mean people compromising. It may mean there are bits of it people don't like. We certainly don't want to remove the opportunity for the market to flex still, because I don't think any producers are going to want fixed contracts that takes away any opportunity for them to take risks and to develop their market opportunities. But for sure there will be areas of commonality. So as I said, price structures, standards, dispute resolution. But it's all going to be open for negotiation. So when we launch that consultation document, and it's likely, let's be honest, that we probably will want to talk to a few of you before we launch that document to make sure that we are hitting the right tunes, so to speak. That the document that we do present is likely to at least be met with some sense of consensus.
Okay, John, thank you. Any further questions from the floor? It'll certainly be interesting to see how it develops, and I would certainly say we need to urge everybody who's involved in this across the supply chain to take part in it. It'll be very easy to come back and criticise later, but if you've had the opportunity, they should get involved.
And sorry, Gary, I forgot to answer your other question, which I can see you looking at me, which is whether this process will fall in the event of election. I don't know, and I'm not even going to speculate on what the outcome of an election would be. My understanding is that this government is certainly committed to it, and my understanding from what opposition spokesmen have said that they too support fairness in the supply chain. So I would hope that nothing would happen, but of course that's not for me to speculate. But my hope and wish would be that it would continue, and certainly officials would recommend to new ministers of any form of government that this is actually quite an important thing for the long-term profitability and sustainability for each of the sectors for which we've done supply chain fairness reviews.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. It'll be interesting to see where we are this time in 2 years' time. So thank you, everybody, for coming along. I hope you enjoyed our little session here, and enjoy the rest of the day.